Thanks, folks, for having me and for spending time with us on this beautiful Wednesday morning or afternoon, wherever you are. So, today's topic, as the title would suggest, building blocks of a strategic workforce plan for today and tomorrow, is meant to give you folks a sense of kind of where we might begin. As many of you know and perhaps have participated in, HCI has a 2-day strategic workforce planning certification, and frankly, 2 days isn't even enough time to cover the topic from start to finish. So what we're hoping to do in today's time is to be able to give you a sense of kind of some key things to think about and ways to get started. Perhaps you're already underway and ways to improve what you're doing in terms of strategic workforce planning. And hopefully spend this hour coming away with some tools and ideas that perhaps you hadn't thought of before. So our agenda along those lines, really three things. One is we'll start with a little bit of background and context of strategic workforce planning. One of the things that I think is challenging about this topic is that people have been talking about workforce planning for decades. And when you ask people what workforce planning really means, you're likely to get several different answers depending on kind of what their perspective or their mindset in relation to workforce planning is. So we'll start with a little bit of background and context of what we think of as strategic workforce planning. Then we'll get right into these three key building blocks, and we'll talk about some ways that even absent a lot of the sort of time and resources and technology that you might need in order to become long-term successful in workforce planning, you can get started today and hopefully begin to have almost immediate impact on your organization. As part of those building blocks, though, we'll talk about implementing and adapting strategic workforce planning. And I think that the thing that's important to know there is the world really does change much faster than ever before. For those that haven't had the opportunity to see it, I highly recommend, and if you're taking notes, a white paper that came out last year from PricewaterhouseCoopers called Global Megatrends 2015. And the global megatrends research is really interesting, but what it really points to is that we live in a much more dynamic world than probably we even realize. And being able to adapt to that is an important part of the outcomes of strategic workforce planning. So as we think about what we would think of as traditional workforce planning, these are things that, as the little box on the right-hand side would indicate here, we've been talking about for decades. So Peter Capelli is a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's written a book called Talent on Demand. Came out a number of years ago, I would say 6 or 7 years ago now. And in Talent on Demand, he makes the case that organizations have been really doing the idea of forecasting what their internal supply is going to look like for a long time. So if you think about fluctuations in manufacturing environments, for instance, we go with seasonal spikes and we staff up and staff down at various times of the year. And in essence, that's what manpower planning has been about. And it's not that that's less important today, but that by itself, it's no longer sufficient. Because as we live in a place where things are happening much more dynamically, as strategic plans of organizations change, organizations, I saw in a newspaper article the other day that said that Google is now getting ready to compete with Uber and the driving business. Well, 5 years ago, if you were thinking about what the future of what had primarily been a technology-based organization had been up until that point, you probably wouldn't have necessarily thought that that was a road that they were going down. And so to be able to adapt dynamically is a big part of what's required now as we think about strategic workforce planning. This is a chevron that we show in the course, and it gives you a sense here. And when you think about the word evolution, it seems like maybe the things at the bottom stages of the model here are not as useful, but they are all important. So headcount planning is still important. Headcount planning is very much sort of saying, well, this is how many people we have today, and if we continue to grow at 5%, which is what we grew at last year, then we're going to need this many people tomorrow. Again, the challenge for that at face value, and again, I think there's value there in going through that exercise, is that the 5% that you grew at last year could become 25% this year, or it could be minus 5%, and that has a lot to do with kind of the overall dynamics of a marketplace that are not internal factors, that's primarily driven by the external world. The next level up from headcount planning is workforce analytics, and this is being able to think pretty deeply about what the current state of our workforce looks like. I would say that most organizations have lots to do here in this second box of the chevron, being able to look at what the retirement rates for people in strategic roles, which we'll talk more about in a minute, what the level of performance is, time to proficiency in strategic roles, all questions the workforce analytics can help us answer. But first you have to sort of know the questions, and we'll talk about that process as we go through. Out of that springs the idea of operational workforce planning, which is beginning to get predictive. It's looking at kind of modeling a variety of different internal trends and saying to ourselves, well, if these internal trends continue, then we're going to do this. The strategic workforce planning takes that a step further, which is not only thinking about kind of internal trends, but also external trends so that you can begin to go through the process of scenario modeling and scenario planning. These are just a couple different sort of charts that will give you a sense of kind of what we mean by the difference between operational and strategic workforce planning. In an operational workforce plan, you're generally thinking about the next 12 months. So how many people are we going to need at various intervals in various roles? The inputs are mostly internal data. Some of them could be based, there could be some management decisions based on those, but they're all aligning toward the current business plan, which means, again, the outcomes that we've sort of dictated as an organization is the way that we're going to ultimately make our strategic plan happen. The strategic workforce plan, though, is usually thinking out 2 to 3 to 5 years, not usually much farther than that, but a little farther out so that you can begin to say to yourself, if a variety of things happen in the external world, we're going to change our strategic approach to be able to deal with those things. And we do those things in business all the time. We will oftentimes create new business strategies to enter new markets, to create new products, to scale back in a particular part of the organization. But the idea of strategic workforce planning is to be able to take the talent implications of all of those things and use them to influence the plan and then also influence the execution of the plan. So I'll be interested. At the end of the day, I think, as Randy said, we're going to save some time for questions. If you folks have more questions about kind of that difference between operational and strategic workforce planning, that might be something that we want to get into a little bit later on as we get to the questions and answers session. So this is the model for strategic workforce planning that we teach at HCI, and it's been around since 2010. I am gratified because I was running the education business when it was created, that it has become, I think, a pretty well-accepted view of the way that the workforce planning process works. It is a truism that almost everything at HCI begins at the noon hour on this model, which is really where is the organization trying to go? What is its business strategy? Out of that business strategy that gets defined, our estimation is that the next and first most important process in workforce planning is to be able to segment roles. And I'm going to talk more about this when we get to these building blocks in a second. Out of that role segmentation comes an exercise we call environment scanning. For those of you that have done things like SWOT analyses before, environment scanning is very similar. So in a SWOT analysis, you have a 4-box of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. 2 of the things are internal, 2 of them are external. In an environment scan, you've got basically supply and demand in relation to both internal and external factors. So you're thinking about a variety of different kinds of things that could be happening in the environment. And again, I'm going to give you an example of this that would impact those strategic roles. Out of those things comes the idea of a future state, being able to think about where it is that we're trying to go. And generally, scenario planning is the easiest way to accomplish this. So we begin to think about, well, what happens if this happens versus that? So for instance, in the insurance world these days, there's obviously lots of questions and comments about what might happen with the Affordable Care Act and the elections that are coming up in November. Well, one scenario would suggest that nothing's going to happen, that it's going to stay as it is. Another might be that it may be expanded in some certain way, or another may be that it may be rolled back or scaled back in a certain way. Each one of those 3 different scenarios has a different outcome for the workforce that is related to that particular delivery of services and products in the healthcare space. So being able to think about those scenarios and then come out of that with a targeted future state is very much the idea of workforce planning. In order to be able to actually get to the stage that's over at about 9 o'clock, if you think about this as a wheels of a clock, at 9 o'clock position, you've got action planning. Action planning generally involves things like, well, we've decided to hire more people. or we decided to work with contractors more, or we're going to redeploy people internally. That action plan comes from a gap analysis that is the comparison of our current state with our future state, our targeted future state. And then last but not least is this idea of monitor and report. We'll talk more about this as well. But again, part of the whole idea of workforce planning is that it's not a one-time activity. It is an ongoing activity that we're going to use to help drive business decisions. So the three things that we'll talk about today, we'll begin with the idea of role segmentation. And the beautiful thing about role segmentation is that it forces prioritization. The fact is that the exercises that are involved, the data that needs to be collected, the analysis that needs to happen are way too time-consuming in order for organizations to be able to do them for every role in the organization. So the question becomes, if we've only got so much time to spend on workforce planning, where should we spend it? And where we should spend it is really on the roles that most contribute to business value. So that's the concept of role segmentation. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Then we'll talk about some challenges that exist today in most organizations, and I'll give you a well-known brand as a case study in this, about understanding what your current state really looks like. Because in the current state analysis, if the CEO walks up to you and says, how many people work at this organization? They might get 5 different answers depending on who they talk to. And it isn't because people in HR don't know the answer or don't have access to the information. It's because the definition is different. And so because that's the case, we need to be able to replace data that is non-standardized and not usable with data that can become more valuable. And we'll talk about that migration. And last but not least is this idea of monitoring and reacting to a dynamic world. The bullet here says this morning's strategy may not be this afternoon's. And it's almost that granular, folks. If we're not reacting and rethinking what our strategy is, every few months, we're probably falling behind. And I'll talk more about that at the very end today. So the idea of role segmentation is this. Presumably, everybody that works at your organization is important. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. So yes, there are going to be roles that are probably misaligned. We'll talk about this idea in a minute. But for the most part, most of the people that are coming to work every day are important. And if you ask people, particularly managers, what roles on your team are most important, they're going to say all the roles are important. Having said that, we have to start, if we're going to do role segmentation effectively, by buying into the concept that some jobs are more important than others. That because there is a direct relationship between the work that's happening in a job and the strategic outcomes of the organization, that some jobs just frankly are delivering more value. And so the way that we think about this is the connection point between where value gets created for the organization, understanding that every organization is different, and which jobs actually make that value happen. So the easiest way to think about role segmentation is some examples. These are a few of them. FedEx, which is now, I think, the world's largest airline. Maybe we have some attendees from FedEx out there today. It's an enormous business. There are lots of things at FedEx that contribute to the value of the organization. But if you ask yourself, how does FedEx compete? FedEx competes because it is reliably delivering quickly, safely, efficiently packages from point A to point B and arriving at a consumer's desktop or a business desktop as quickly as possible. And because that's the case, the couriers at FedEx are one of their strategic roles. Now, there are thousands of people performing these, so it's not 10 to 15% of the people in the organization. It's 10 to 15% of the jobs that are adding the most value, and the couriers are tremendously important at FedEx. You could also say that the people that are directly dealing with the customers in almost any industry are going to be really important, and they are, but the strategies are different in different kinds of companies. So to contrast FedEx versus the next one on the list here, Costco, Costco's value is really more and more about the ability to buy really high quality, different kinds of things all in one central place. I read an article recently about the Costco brands and the value of the food that gets delivered in the Costco house brand. And because that's the case, it's the buyers of those brands that are the strategic role. Because Costco has decided to compete against Walmart, for instance, by being able to be differentiated in terms of the products that it's selling and very high quality in those products. That's not quite the same thing as a Walmart, for instance, which has more and more focus on the supply chain, on being able to get um, products redistributed on shelves as quickly as possible. One more on this example. If you think about Disney parks, if anybody's been to Disney World, um, the signature tagline is "Have a magical day." And having a magical day involves all kinds of things. It involves ride operators. It involves the people that are serving the food. It involves Mickey Mouse and Goofy. But ultimately, Mickey and Goofy can't talk. So if you're having a magical day, it's probably because your interactions with people that are actually on the front lines of making your experience a good one have happened properly. And so at Disney parks, for instance, the role of street sweepers, the people that are actually cleaning up, that can answer questions about where the restrooms are or where to go for lunch, are going to be much more valuable than just the value of the people that design the rides or are inside the costumes. Our take on roles is that there are really four different types within most organizations. You've got strategic roles, which again represent 10 to 15% of the overall roles inside a company. Ask yourself, how do we compete against our competitors? We do something, they do something different. And if you can think about that differentiation, then think about the source of that differentiation as the strategic roles that are going to be that 10 to 15% that add the most value. The next level down are core roles, and these are another 20%. They are the people that are related to operational excellence. So the old quote is, these are the people that keep the lights on. Obviously, very important folks inside any company, very important roles, but not quite at the level of the strategic roles that add value in a variety of different ways. For many people in HR or finance or to some extent marketing, we're in support roles. And support roles aren't bad. Every organization has to have them, and we wouldn't be successful if we didn't think weren't filled, but they don't add the same level of strategic value as the people in the strategic roles do. And then you've got people that are in misaligned roles. Generally, these are people doing work that were aligned to the strategy of last year. So being able to sort of think about what that 10% or 15% of roles is really what role segmentation is all about. This last bit at the slide, at the bottom of the slide, though, comes from Tracy Smith, who actually is at FedEx, who was presented at a couple of our conferences at HCI. And one of the points that she makes is that lots of times people will argue, well, if you ask business leaders, which roles are your strategic roles, they're all going to say, well, they all are. They're all really important. So she's gotten past that by just let's call them roles of interest. Instead of strategic or core or support, let's just say which ones we're really interested in today versus some other time in the future. And that may be a useful way for you to think about it as well. Just two more examples, and I think this will clarify for perhaps folks that are trying to get this concept of strategic roles, what the difference between them is. So at both of these companies, Starbucks and McDonald's, which you can see on the screen, you've basically got a model in which some number of people are taking money from customers and providing some level of service relatively pretty quickly. These are not sit-down restaurants that take 35 minutes to get something. Baristas may take a little longer to make the coffee than the folks at McDonald's do to make the Big Mac, but same idea. But value is created in quite different ways. So Starbucks is the organization that trained us that it was okay to charge $3.50 for coffee. So that relationship that went from a place where we used to spend a quarter for a cup of coffee to a place where we now spend $3.50 for a grande latte, is that the difference became the experience, and that experience is created by the barista who remembers kind of what you're interested in if you come out back on a regular basis, what kinds of things you want, who is, knows all the different sort of flavors of coffee and what kinds of things are available in each one of them, is expert at remembering that you wanted the double, the half calf, triple calf with 3 shots, whatever it is. That barista is creating the strategic values for Starbucks in a way that the person that's taking your money at McDonald's is not. The person that's taking your order at McDonald's, their primary job is to make sure they get it into the system efficiently, and that the system then tells everybody else what to produce, which is all produced in the exact same way every time. Because we go to McDonald's for a predictable, clean, fast experience, the question then becomes, well, if at McDonald's the value is created by the restaurant manager, who is the person that's making all of those things happen. They're the person that's training everybody to make the French fries the right way, and the person that's training the front desk person, the person that's taking the money, to count it out in a certain way so that it always happens predictably. And so again, the real question is two different companies that sort of look like they do the same thing, but compete in a very different way. And that's the key element to keep in mind when you think about strategic roles. So the next section, if you got that down and you're sort of thinking about, well, which roles are most important to me, is what does the current state look like for the people that are in these roles? What do we know about them? What do we know about what's going to happen to them in the future? And in order to be able to get to this futuring exercise, we have to begin with a pretty good understanding of the current state. But this is part of our challenge and our legacy in terms of HR. So this is some research that we did with Workday, I think, about 2 years ago. And one of the questions that we asked was, how effective are the various practices within strategic workforce planning? So you can see the relationship to the model that I just walked you folks through. And you can see that the place where people thought that they were most effective was in current state analysis. So just about 2/3 of the people that responded said that our practices are effective in current state analysis. But then if you think about what this chart on the right, which was part of the same study, is telling you, you have to sort of call that into question a little bit, because it says the number of times cited by respondents for why their organization is spending time in strategic workforce planning is skills deficiency in your current workforce. So if what that's telling you is that you have skills deficiency in your current workforce, but you're really good at current state analysis, then why didn't the current state analysis tell you that you had those skills deficiencies? Josh Bersin makes many of the same points in research that he's done. So he says only about 14% have gotten to the higher levels of actually thinking about HR data, even though the financial benefits of doing so are sort of pretty well understood at this point. So 4% of organizations have gotten to a stage called predictive analytics, the sort of holy grail. Another 10% have gotten to advanced analytics, and most organizations are still at the baseline level of operational reporting. So fairly standard dashboards that aren't necessarily telling us a whole lot. And the reasons for that are a myriad. There are all kinds of different reasons. But I think many of them are summarized in the video that I'm going to share with you now. So we had Robert Gibby, as you can see. I think Robert has moved on from Procter & Gamble, but he presented at our workforce planning conference about 3 years ago now, and was telling us the story about how Procter & Gamble began to think about the migration of what they were currently doing in relation to HR analytics into a future state. And so Robert will walk you through some challenges that they had here, and I'd be interested, again, as we get to questions and comments at the end, to hear if these resonate with you folks and you're having similar ones. So let's play the video here from Robert Gibby.
And then as part of all this, and kind of in the spirit of productivity, we needed to drive simplification. So we needed to make things easier, faster, cleaner in terms of how our HR partners and the line was using information about people in the company to make decisions. And as part of that, we wanted it to be pretty, we wanted it to be in dashboards, we wanted it to be real time, all the stuff that you see kind of the industry trend for today. So against that, we had to go back and assess, where are we today? What do we actually have? What is the state of the business in terms of doing HR analytics within the company? And what we found is that there are actually a lot of challenges for being able to do analytics, and we'll talk a little bit about what analytics means to us as we get through the next several slides. But even in being able to manage the data, to be able to actually touch the information, we had challenges in terms of it being really across a number of different systems. So if you think about HR and the development of HR and HR practices or centers of excellence, we have very strong recruiting capability. We have strong performance management capability. We're very good and known for developing leaders. We have work and development planning, action planning, linking people's actual work to the strategic imperatives of the organization. We do comp and ben, we do our engagement survey. We have all these different work processes in HR and all these different systems that have been developed, but none of them talk to each other, which is kind of ironic considering that's kind of a core competency of HR people, right? We're out talking to everybody and working to develop the culture, but our systems don't talk to each other. So that was a big challenge that we needed to figure out how to overcome. I think within that, we also have a huge instance of SAP. We have a global instance of SAP for our HRIS, and we do have global data across the entire enterprise. So for our 120,000 or so employees, we have standard core data that provides a good foundation for us. But all of our data in that system links to a person. We do not have a position management system, a position data system, which is ironic considering we're a build from within company. But decisions have been made over the years to not input that capability. And so we had to work around that in terms of how we were looking at it. Because we don't have a position management system, as many of you are probably familiar, we don't actually have an organization structure in a system somewhere that truly represents the people that are within an organization. What we have is a cost center structure. So everything rolls up against a financial hierarchy. So that was a big challenge to manage. As I described, our data systems are highly customized. They're programmed in different languages. Getting them to talk to each other or to send data is a challenge. And even within talent management, the data that we have is loosely integrated. So a lot of the data, especially at lower levels in the organization for people, is on people's desktops, is with the managers, is with the people that are making those decisions more locally on our talent. And so those were kind of some challenges as we started to look around within the organization and say, we really want to put in kind of global HR-wide analytics capabilities.
So my sense is, as I've talked to other people that have gone through this exercise, and we put this video into our workforce planning course this past year, primarily because people were having the same question about workforce planning, which is what data do we need? And I think Robert Gibby's problem is indicative of some of the challenges that you have. One of them is this idea of position management. So position management systems, for those that haven't sort of thought about it in this way, allow you to track data in relation to a particular role as opposed to in relation to the person filling that role. And the problem with having it tied to a particular person, well, actually there's several problems with it, but one is if that person leaves, then the linkages between a variety of different roles no longer live within your data. The second, and perhaps more important from a workforce planning perspective, is that because things do roll up in a position management system, to a particular role, you can look at the answers much more readily to questions like, what are our strategic roles? And what is the level of performance in our strategic roles? And what is the score that we're getting on our employee satisfaction survey in terms of our strategic roles? So you can begin to answer questions in different ways once you have the data that's tied to roles versus tied to people. Again, I'd be happy to get into that a little bit more as we get into the Q&A session if you folks like. So they went through 4 pieces to do something about this at P&G, and I'll walk you through very briefly what their world looked like and how they did it. But as I was thinking about what might be instructive in an hour-long session on workforce planning, a similar process to this could put your organization significantly forward. So the first thing that they did was that they went through an exercise to define the things that people really wanted to know the answer to. And they went sort of across the organization and did kind of a stakeholder analysis with lots and lots of different people. And they said, well, what do you want to know? And these are just a handful of sample questions. There were many, many of them that people would surface. But as they began to look at the commonalities between, well, what do people want to know and what do we have access to, they could get a little farther down the line toward understanding what kinds of sort of questions people wanted to have the answer to on a regular basis. So again, you can see that the workforce planning, they use the term critical role versus strategic, but the concept is the same. Where are your vacant positions? What's the position history for a person or a person history for a position? Different kinds of questions that they wanted to know the answer to. And they use those questions to help them suss out, well, these are the things that we want to deliver on a regular basis, and these are the things we need to standardize on. The second part of the process was to institute clear governance. So I don't know if you folks noticed in Robert Gibby's title, but his job is in HR operations. So he's within the HR function, but his part of the organization has been given clear mandate to fix this problem. It's not sort of a centralized standard HR problem. It is one that lives within a particular part of the organization. And so they created this global HR operations function that would help them do a few things. And one is to document clear standards. And that really means be able to say, these are things that we want to be able to, how we want to define a variety of different terms. So if we're going to talk about attrition, you could get a lot of different answers to what attrition means. But here's what it means to Procter & Gamble, And now all organizations, as they think about attrition, use that exact same definition, so that you become this idea of the term that he uses is a single source of truth. We become the place where the answer to this question, at least as we understand the definition, is all going to be in one central place. They also began to drive and train people on analytics within HR. And I have to say, in our HR business partner course at HCI, this idea of becoming better at analytics is one of the key elements that lots and lots of HR business partners are working on, because being able to make data-driven decisions has become very effective, an effective part of different companies. They also helped to bring a variety of different siloed efforts that were happening in different parts of the company. So lots of different parts of the company had information spreadsheets, or in one part of the business unit but not another business unit. And so they helped to sort of integrate all of those pieces together. But ultimately, the key message here is this idea of instituting clear governance and creating sort of a standardized data dictionary that people across the organization could use. The third part of their journey, if you will, was to begin to then integrate the data, to pull it all into a central place, so that all the different places that he talked about that didn't talk to each other began to talk to each other, and to begin the process of creating standard reports based on that. So as you can see on the slide, obviously you can't read the slides themselves, and when he first presented it, you couldn't either. It's not really about what's on the slide, but you can see the color schemes. So they very much ran all of their data against kind of a standard red, yellow, green, so people could see at a glance where their particular department was. And then at the bottom left of this slide, they used this kind of a content visualization strategy where you had a process map, so you could see, well, if we're getting lower than average scores or lower than the scores that we want in one particular area, then these are the actions that we should take in relation to a variety of things. So you could see a whole sort of a mapping process that came out of this as well. It's also important that he talks about that they began to run reports manually first, and then created standard reports that people could create with a single button click capability. And the reason for that was that they wanted people to understand what was going into the reports, so that they began to trust the data that was coming out of them better than they would have had they just been given kind of a black box and pressed a button to get something back. And then last but not least, they began to implement solutions that they created these standard reports that people could see. And notably, he talked about the fact that this process itself took them about a year and a half to fix at Procter & Gamble. And they were still only part of the way toward the places that they wanted to get to. They wanted to be able to get to, if you think back to the Josh Bersin slide where you've got 4% of organizations doing predictive analytics, they wanted to become more predictive so that they could see what was going to happen based on a variety of different data points that were in relation to workforce planning. And then last but not least, to integrate those insights within the processes of the organization, so that if they found out, for instance, that managers that spent more time with their teams were more effective in terms of delivering performance, that they could then work that into the way that they were evaluating manager performance in the first place. As you think about current state data, this topic is both very simple and very complex. There are lots and lots of different things we can think about in relation to what kind of data we need for workforce planning. But ultimately, it comes down to two different buckets. You've either got capacity data, which is really telling you, do I have the people that I need to get the work done? Do I have enough of them? Or capability data, which means, do I have the skills that I need to get the work done? And those are two very different kinds of questions. But almost all of the data that you're going to need for the workforce planning journey are going to fall into one of those two buckets. And remember that it's role data and not people data that ultimately produces insights for us. So as some examples of capacity data, you've got things like headcount by location in strategic roles. And by the way, you'll see that on all of these different slides, we've instituted strategic roles. Again, you can call them roles of interest if you prefer. But we're not looking for vacancy rates for everybody at the organization or attrition rates for everybody in the organization. If we're looking for insight and impact, what we really want to focus on is the headcount for people in roles of interest or strategic roles, or the retirement eligibility of people in strategic roles. So those are examples of capacity data. Here are some examples of capability data. Again, these are when we think about the competency maps or the things that we are The way that we define our strategic roles, well, what are the competencies required for those? What is the performance rating of people in strategic roles? What percentage of people in our strategic roles are high performers versus low performers? What is the time to proficiency for new hires? So how long does it take for each strategic role for somebody to come in from in the door to fully proficient in their role? Just some other examples here. But basically, you're going to find that as you go through the workforce planning journey, there are two main questions you need to ask yourself in relation to your current state. One question is, do I have the people to get the work done? And the other question is, do I have the skills to get the work done? And most of the things you're going to want to know are going to be the answers to those two different questions. So I wanted to close with just a couple thoughts on workforce planning in a state of perpetual change. You could read the quote here. In business, the competition will bite you if you keep running. If you stand still, they'll swallow you. It is true that the world is much more dynamic than it's ever been before. Our ability to adapt and adjust strategy is critical. And as we wrote, and I wrote the majority of the new material, we updated our workforce planning course last year. And one of the questions that people would ask after they went through one of the early iterations of the course was, does it even make sense to think about workforce planning when the world changes as quickly as it does? And it's a fair question, but I think the really only answer is, well, what are the alternatives? So this idea of being able to adapt, monitor and report on the left-hand side of the model, rethink business strategy, and use that rethinking of business strategy to influence the way that we think about strategic roles, segment roles, is a critical part of this process because it's not going to happen in one time. It's a constantly evolving, iterative process. As you think about what went wrong with these companies, it was something different for all of them. So you folks probably all remember having a Blockbuster Video on your quarter or a Circuit City that was a couple miles away down in the shopping center area of your town. Those stores are all gone today, and as are many other businesses as well. And what we found in looking at why this happens is that it's usually not a single factor. The reason I have the slide here that says good to great in search of excellence, these are great business books, both of them. But they highlight companies that, frankly, haven't made it. And so the question is, what went wrong with these companies? And there is a growing body of evidence that suggests that we can see the things that are coming if we know what they are. So a while back, Harvard Business Review did a case study or a bit of analysis with the Corporate Leadership Council, CEP, on kind of what was happening inside companies that failed. And they looked at a number of large Fortune 100 companies over a 50-year time period. And they found that 87%, most of them, had stalled out, if you will. They had stopped growing for a period of time at least once. And what they found was that most of those factors, 87% of the factors themselves, were actually internal. They weren't things that were happening outside of their control. They were things that were within management's control. So they had an innovation management breakdown, for instance, or they didn't have enough talent bench to be able to grow at the rate that they thought they were going to grow. And you can look at the individual statistics below this, but only 13% were actually things like regulatory actions or an economic downturn. They were mostly things that were within our control if we were doing an active enough, what I would think of as environment scan. Similar research about 2 years ago now. So this is from a guy by the name of Ed Lawler at the University of Southern California and his colleague Chris Worley, who wrote a book called The Agility Factor. And they looked at 234 companies in 18 industries, again, long time period. So they looked over a 30-year performance. And they took all of these companies and binned them into three types. There were outperformers, there were thrashers, companies that actually went up and down, and then there were underperformers that historically over that time period didn't go out of business, but underperformed the rest of their industry. And they found that the outperformers were characterized by four main things. First, that they were able to rethink their strategy pretty dynamically and pretty immediately. Second, they were able to perceive environmental change, which I'll talk more about in a second. Third, they were able to test responses, meaning that they were able to try different things out, fail fast, do different things rapidly. And fourth, they were able to implement change by using a variety of ways of using information up and down through the organization. But the perceiving environmental change one is important, and so I wanted to leave you with some ideas on ways to see things happening out there in the landscape that perhaps we're not seeing today. The first of them, and I would talk about kind of three key listening posts here, would be external customers. In my experience in talking to our students in our HCI classes, one question I often ask students is, when is the last time you talked to an external customer, a person that actually buys your product or services? And the answer is not usually very frequently, not too recently. This is an opportunity. Now, obviously there are challenges in being able to figure out a way to get in front of your customers in some cases. So if you can't, then you can't. But being able to figure out how to try to do it would be important, because external customers can answer these kinds of questions. What do you like best about what we're doing? Well, that's a key element of the strategy, right? Be able to understand kind of what roles are related to that thing. What do you wish we did better? What features are available from other companies, other suppliers that are producing our good or service that we don't have today? And by being able to hear directly from external customers about those things, we can see a lot of signs of both strengths and weaknesses that we might not otherwise see. The same thing is true with internal stakeholders. So we can see if we're talking to salespeople about what products are selling well, what products aren't. If we're constantly in touch with operations, we can understand kind of where there are gaps in the way the products or services are being presented. Finance can give us, obviously, the financial perspective on a lot of things. Regulatory affairs. I mentioned the megatrends research that we saw last year from PwC, and one of their megatrends was the increased likelihood that we're going to get more and more regulation in our world, not less and less. And because that's the case, regulatory affairs can offer a perspective on what our strengths and weaknesses are and what kinds of external factors might impact our strategic roles. And then last but not least, this is the simplest one. So this is a picture of the Wall Street Journal that came to my mailbox over the weekend, and I live in the hinterlands of rural Vermont. So the Wall Street Journal can come here every day. It can certainly come to where you folks are as well. And I just took one paper and highlighted with the orange highlighter here a few articles that were in it that would pretty significantly impact your business if you happen to be in that space. One of them was about a lower bar proposed for co-pilots, so how much time they were going to need to fly in the air. If you're in the airline industry and you're looking for pilots, that certainly is a key input that you're going to need to know the answer to. Up at the top, you've got the jobs data probably predicting the fact that interest rates won't go up, or at least much, if at all, by the end of the year. Again, depending on your industry, potentially very important. If you do nothing else based on today's webcast, I would invest, and I'm not here to sell newspaper subscriptions, that you guys invest in the Wall Street Journal or a similar kind of business paper, because on a regular basis, there are lots of questions that need to be answered here. How would this particular news story change our product or service strategy? How would that change impact the makeup of our strategic roles? Would we have to think differently about what our strategic roles are based on that change? How could the external supply of talent for strategic roles be impacted by this development that we're reading about? Again, this is the front page of the Wall Street Journal. If I went through this exercise, you'd probably find at least 10 articles at any given version of the newspaper. And what I'd recommend is that if you've got a team that's working on workforce planning, get yourself the subscription. Spend 10 minutes a day going through the newspaper. And by the way, I do recommend hard copy versus electronic versions, just because it puts it in front of you. It makes it a tangible activity. And once every couple of weeks, spend time with the other stakeholders on workforce planning and bring those articles and say, do we have a scenario here? What could the different scenarios look like, and how would we react differently from a talent perspective, from a build, buy, borrow perspective on each one of these potential developments, and what would we do if it turns out, at one end of the spectrum versus what we would do if it turned out at the other end of the spectrum. So that is about as much information. I think I talked really fast for about 45 minutes there, but hopefully it was useful. But I would like to take these last few minutes that we have with us and take questions if you folks have questions about the content that we've covered today.
Bill, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise on this topic. And for sharing the model and that other information with our webcast attendees. I think it was all very useful. We have had some questions come in over the course of the webcast, so we do want to get to as many of those as we can here in the few minutes we have left. HCI members, if you haven't yet submitted any questions, you can do that now. You can do that in a couple of ways. You can enter those questions right there in the chat box on the webcast page. Just be sure to include your name with those questions, or you can also tweet questions with the hashtag HCI chat if you're following along on Twitter. So let's go ahead and get right into our first question here, Bill. You've talked a lot about the strategic roles in the organization. How often should companies be reviewing and modifying those strategic roles?
It's a good question. I think probably every year at least. I think that the idea of strategic workforce planning is such that you're thinking generally 3 to 5 years out. So it isn't something that you're going to be doing every day. It probably isn't practical to do every month. But at least once a year, you ought to be going back to yourself. If you've identified 10 to 15% of your roles as strategic, so in an organization that has 1,000 roles, as many organizations do, that's about 100 different jobs. How many of those 100 are still the most important? Is there a group of 10 to 15, 20 that should be part of this process that we didn't foresee last year? I would call that an annual, at least once a year activity, maybe twice a year, depending on the makeup of the team and how much time they have to do this kind of thing.
And let's talk a little bit about data and analytics. A big barrier to using data more effectively is often access to that data. What should folks do if they don't have access to all the types of data that you mentioned regarding capacity or capability data?
Yeah, so I think one key thing to keep in mind here is that, first of all, data is never going to be perfect. So you're going to spend a lot of time going through the process of sifting through your data, trying to understand what you have, and in that process, you're going to find out two things. One is you don't have everything that you want, and the second is that even the things that you do have aren't necessarily accurate. You can't stop. So my recommendation, and I think the recommendation of most of the practitioners that do workforce planning effectively, is to take what you have and base as much insight as you can on it, while you're also parallel processing for cleaning up the data in the background. So you might think about it as having 2 or 3 different work streams of people that are working on different things in relation to strategic workforce planning. One work stream might be the actual workforce planning nuts and bolts, which is the idea of role segmentation, understanding kind of what you're working with business leaders to understand what the individual roles are going to be. Another work stream would be people that are working in the background to clean up the data and run reports. And then a third work stream might be people that are continuing to run the kind of ad hoc reporting that is already happening in fact, most organizations. So somebody's going to have to keep responding to the needs of business leaders who want to see a variety of different things. So you might think about it that way, but the real answer to the question is use what you have and try to build what you don't in the background while you're already using what you have. But don't wait for the data to be perfect, because it never will be.
Great. I'm glad you mentioned the different work streams and the different tasks involved with acquiring that data and putting it to use. So as far as a strategic workforce planning practice in an organization, where does all of that work fall? What department should that be a part of? Should it be a department unto itself? How can smaller companies scale for that capability?
It's a good question. I think there's a few different answers to that. I would think about, I'm going to go back to the term work stream here for a second, but I think you've got really 3 different camps of people that are involved with the workforce planning process inside even very large but also small organizations. You've got one group of people that have become pretty proficient in the idea of workforce planning. So they understand this idea of role segmentation. They're active in the idea of futuring, environment scanning, sort of thinking about the future, both short-term and long-term from an operational and long-term perspective. Then you've got HR, and the HR organization is primarily to serve as a conduit. Now, this strategic workforce planning expertise, the SME, if you will, can reside within HR, but doesn't necessarily have to. But the HR group has to be the partner that helps this third group understand what to do about workforce planning. because ultimately the business line itself needs to understand and probably own workforce planning efforts. Because let's just say that our strategic role is a certain type of chemical engineer. If we say to ourselves, well, we're going to need to increase the number of chemical engineers with this skill set by 15% in the next year, then the person that's going to have to do all the hiring, the person that's going to have to redeploy people on their current team to allow for this, is the business leader that chemical engineer is going to be working within. And so the business leader has to own workforce planning. The SME does the heavy lifting, and the HR group helps to be the conduit between those two different camps so that the information is flowing from the SME to the business leader, and the business leader's perspective on strategic roles and so forth is moving back to the other side, to the SME. And so I think about it in those three different buckets.
Great. And let's talk about another big aspect of workforce planning, technology. There are lots of tools out there that folks can leverage to make the planning process a little bit easier. What are some key things that folks should think about if they're looking at evaluating some technology for strategic workforce planning?
Yeah, so one of the key elements that you'd want to be looking at is this idea of position management, which I referred to earlier. I think being able to separate HR data from an individual person and categorize it by role is a very important, from a workforce planning perspective, capability. And lots of the systems out there, I know the Workday is sponsoring the webcast, but I say this not because they're the sponsor, but because they're a primary player, are able to do position management, and that's one important thing to be looking for. Another is how readily the technology provider will help to bridge the gap between a variety of different kinds of disparate sources. So again, from a workforce planning perspective, there are elements of the talent acquisition system that we're going to want, so the applicant tracking system. There are also elements of the learning management system, the HRIS, all kinds of different places within the overall ecosystem of HR are going to be relevant to the workforce planning process. And so one of the things I'd be looking for in evaluating any sort of technology solution is how readily can we use a new solution to help bridge the gap between a variety of things that we already have and can plan on continuing to use. And the third sort of thing I'd be thinking about from a technology perspective is there a way to get started small? Is there something we can try out and see how it works, and then move to a more mature view as you go down the road? I think one of the things that is true in the analytics space in general is that starting with relatively modest systems and using them in a particular focused way, and then using that same modest system in a broader way, and then beginning to invest in technology that will help take a more sophisticated system across the organization is sort of the right decision path. But if you jump right into a very technical system without knowing what the outcomes that you're looking for are, it can become a lot more difficult to actually get the results that you're after.
Great. And this is an interesting question, one I hadn't actually thought about yet. How is the free agent nation or the gig economy or, the tour of duty kind of mentality as far as employment goes, how is that going to impact successful workforce planning?
No, that's a great question. Hadn't really thought about the answer to it either, Randy. I think that it's a topic I spent a lot of time thinking about. I mentioned Megatrends 2015. One of the things that report talks about is the fact that 40% of the U.S. workforce by 2020 will be contractors or freelancers. And that is going to dramatically impact our ability to plan. I think my early inclination on that front is that one of the things that we'll have to be much more cognizant of is the correct build, buy, borrow percentage. So as we think about filling gaps from a 3 to 5 year perspective on our strategic roles, is there a way to use what we would think of as borrow, which is using freelancers or contract labor or some other approach that isn't full-time employees or redevelopment of employees, to get work done? And so I think what we'll start to see is that the gig economy or free agent nation, or I think what we talked about is tours of duty at LinkedIn, are going to manifest themselves as a probably emergence of this borrow world much more than we've thought about before. And so the good news about that is, one of the inherent advantages of contract workforce is that it's going to be more flexible. The more challenging part is, and this is for another webcast that would be several hours in its own right probably, is that there are a lot of institutional challenges toward using more contractors that are made more difficult by regulation, for instance. And so the question becomes, how do we become more flexible and agile in terms of being able to redeploy people into contractor roles to fill the needs that workforce planning is surfacing for us?
Great, Bill. Thank you so much. We have come to the end of our material for today, so we are going to wrap things up for now. Folks, please feel free to continue this discussion on Twitter under the hashtag HCI Chat. You can also take a look at the Attend a Conference link at the top of this page to get registered for an upcoming event, either in person or a virtual event. I do want to say one more thank you to our speaker, Bill Crabe, and to our webcast sponsor, Workday, for making this presentation possible. Of course, the biggest thank you of all goes out to all of our HCI members. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to spend with us and look forward to seeing you on another webcast soon. Thanks again and have a great day.